So very happy that we could have this webinar together, and welcome to all of you that are tuning in. My name is Karin, work as head of people and culture at Joblon, and with me today I have no one other than the one and only Linnea Bywall, head of operations at Alva Labs. How are you?
I'm great. Super excited to talk about unbiased recruitment.
Yes, and I'm super excited to get the opportunity to talk more with you, because you're kind of my guru in this this topic. I love following everything you do on LinkedIn, and I'm pretty sure that you would agree with me, Linnea, that this is a topic that you cannot get enough of it. So super excited to discuss this with you today. Yeah, but before we do that, just a little recap or a comment about Joblon. Joblon, for those of you who are not familiar with what we do, Joblon is a modern and user-friendly hiring software. So what we do is that we help recruiters and hiring managers all over the world with creating standout candidate experiences and an attractive employer brand. And we also love to talk about the future and what that has in store when it comes to talent acquisition and work overall. So that's short about us. And Linnea, Alva Labs. I love this animation, I can just say. Do something simple.
Yeah, so Alva, for those of you who doesn't know, we are a product that aids in hiring. So we go hand in hand with Joblon, creating a better talent acquisition experience by helping organizations assess candidates in a structured way, using psychometric assessment, using interviews, and using more skill-based tests. So we want to create a efficient job markets, both for recruiters and candidates.
Yes. And I think a lot of things we're going to talk about today is related to both Alva and Joblon as well. So let's start with just take a step back and ask ourselves the big why. Like, why are we sitting here today? Why is this so important to talk about? And I know, Linnea, you have a lot of insight in this subject. So how would you summarize this?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to keep in mind, I think this is a topic that has gotten more and more awareness and attention over the last years for good reasons. But I think it's still important to keep in mind that there are so many pitfalls and like still commonly done mistakes when it comes to hiring, especially when it comes to like traditional hiring. When I say traditional hiring, I mean CV screen, some interviews, and maybe some reference taking, and that's it. So what we know is that leads to a lot of incorrect or like not optimal hiring decisions, where a lot of hires, actually as much as like 46% of all hires, are seen as like not successful. It can be that, you know, the people that you hire, that they leave early, that they don't work out, that they don't function well in the group, and so forth. So there are a lot of reasons, but it's still really interesting that hiring is unfair and not really like correct. And I think there's like two birds, one stone that we're going to talk about here. Is like when you change the way you hire, you can both increase accuracy and decrease biases. So the way that you can work with this is with like creating a lot more like structure and awareness of how you actually work.
And I think it's not just unbiased recruitment that we widen the whole talent space. It's also a lot of the things that you're talking about. I think is super interesting, like just the number you mentioned, like 46% is not accurate. Like, just if we would look at how much money that costs for companies not making the right hires, that could be like its own webinar. And one thing that I think is interesting for us at Joblon, since and I guess same for Alva, since we work with companies all around the world that are hiring a lot, is that we see this as a big trend. I mean, it's something our customers is asking for, which is great. So it's everything from being able to anonymize profiles early on in the process, deciding where you should be able to look at the CV and not. So from my perspective, I think it is actually just the latest like couple of years. I think you could see, of course, a big trend when it comes to companies actually opening up their eyes a bit more and understanding why this is something you actually need to spend time and resources and making sure you have unbiased recruitment processes. Talking about that, and now when we know why this is so important, it's of course one thing to understand that, but it's another thing to actually start practicing this. So that is what we're gonna talk about today, 3 concrete methods that you can use throughout the hiring process. So we're gonna discuss that, Linnea and I, and we're also gonna talk about how you can use them efficiently. And the first one, and this is one of my favorites, the GMA and personality assessment method. So Linnea, could you give us some insights? First of all, I think a lot of people maybe heard about GMA, but like, what is that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And like, even before going into that, I just want to state like all the methods that we will go through. I mean, our idea for this webinar was that, you should make it like really actionable so that you can actually change something. And I think the things that you need to keep in mind, like unbiased recruitment is not necessarily harder, it's just differently. And the things that keep in mind is that it needs to have a clear structure so that you can have the same process for all candidates. Like that's the key. It's that simple. Like if we can provide the exact same experience for all candidates, that will be the key to do an unbiased process. The problem though, is that as soon as we add human to that process, that will indicate that we can't give people the same process. So if I meet 10 candidates, I'm only human, approximately 50% of my assessment of another person, in this case a candidate, will be based on who I am, not based on who they are. That means like each candidate will have approximately 50% wiggle room, and like my assessment will be based only 50% on them, but the rest will be based on like what I have experienced in the past, who I am, my like interpretations of them, which creates an unfair process. Because if I like, what we know is that we tend to like people that are similar to ourselves. I mean, we joked before we started, like you and me, Karin, we have a lot of similarities, right? So we have kind of studied the same things. We have the same type of role in the same type of industry, curly hair. We kind of have matching outfits either, like even today. So I think it's safe to say that like the likability is going to be a lot higher because we're so similar. So the first method then that we will talk about is these like psychometric assessment, meaning assessment that will evaluate different like traits of who someone is. The reason for why this is helpful is because a GMA or personality test will treat everyone the same. GMA in this context stands for general mental ability. A more like commonly used word is probably like a logic test. And a logic test doesn't care about how old you are, how curly your hair is, where you went to school, what outfit you're wearing. It will treat everyone the same. And that's the beauty of it. So if we just quickly look at like why it's helpful to use psychometric assessments, I think it's this fact that it treats everyone the same. The common way to do screening today is often using a CV. When doing that, we know that that will be problematic for some candidate groups and more favorable for other candidate groups. For instance, women, they have to send in 30% more applications than men. People of color have to send in 50% more applications than white. And this is something that can be altered if we instead use screening tools that will actually evaluate someone's like traits, someone's soft skills, who they are. And that's what we can do with the psychometric assessments. So if we start with logic ability, or GMA, what that is a sorry, test that evaluates your like ability to see patterns, draw conclusions, solve problems. And it's very tightly linked to, you know, how fast you learn something, your like quality of your decision making, but most importantly, it's strongly correlated with job performance. So what is being measured, the traits that are being measured in a general mental ability test or a logic test are traits that we actually use on the job. And a lot of the variance in performance can actually be explained by someone's logic ability. If we then take like a personality test, what that is a test that measures your natural tendencies, how someone comes across compared to others. A good personality test will often target like what's called the 5-factor model of personality. So it measures different traits and how you differentiate between like the norm on these different traits. Depending on the job, different traits will be more or less important. Say for a sales role, it might be very helpful if someone is outgoing. For an engineering role, that might be of less importance. A good thing to keep in mind is that some traits are very often helpful. For instance, in the world of psychology referred to as conscientiousness, impossible to spell.
Yeah.
But what it means is pretty much like how driven, goal setting, structured and planning someone is, where a lot of the time it's very helpful to have those traits. So I think hopefully that explains like a little bit what it is and then like how to use it. I think it's the traditional way of using psychometric assessments have been to incorporate quite late in the process. Maybe when like we have our 2 final candidates and you've done this like massive, super expensive assessments, but you've kind of already made up your mind. So regardless of the results, you might still end up hiring your favorites. The way that we can use it in our favor, if we want to have a more like fair process, is to have it earlier on in the process. Meaning like the way we do it is that we like the first thing a candidate will do in a process if they apply for Alva is they will answer some screening questions and then they will complete the psychometric assessment tests. By doing so, we can going from many to few in a much more like data-driven, objective way, so that we will treat all the candidates the same.
Super interesting, and also what you mentioned with like when do you send these tests out? I have a lot of different experiences. Remember from my previous job, we sent it out like as an actual like screening method. So before even looking at a CV, we sent out these tests.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts about that? Because sometimes I can end up in a situation where I, for example, have like source candidates, you know, that
Right.
I reached out to on LinkedIn. Of course, I would love to send these tests like the first thing I do, but sometimes I think that can be tricky, of course. But I guess to summarize it, like the earlier on, the better. Perhaps you cannot always send it out as a screening test, or what are your thoughts about that?
No, I think that's a great point. I think like general rule of thumb, the earlier the better. Yes. And then apparently there's some sort of reality we have to face as recruiters. Don't know what that's about. But I think first thing is like communication. Really important to super like clearly state why you're doing this, like what's the purpose, how are you going to use it, so that it's like clear, you can motivate it to the candidate. Super important. Make sure that the candidate gets something out of it. I mean, I would never send out a test that doesn't automatically give feedback. So there's something in it for the candidate and spell that out. But then like, as you say, like source candidates, I think it's super important to differentiate between assessment and selling. So we will always include a psychometric assessment as the first assessment step, meaning like screening. But sometimes it takes more to convert the candidate. to be an active candidate in the process.
Mm.
So there's absolutely cases where we will have candidates that meet with me, with like my talent acquisition, with the manager, with someone from the team before they even convert. But the important thing is that we don't evaluate the candidate in that step. And so I think like a lot of stuff can happen before they are in the process, but once they're in, you should start with psychometric assessment. So I think like that differentiate between sales and assessment is key.
Yeah. And I think talking about this method and the other two methods that we're going to discuss, what you mentioned in the beginning, like how boring it even might sound, but structure, like if you have a structure, if you put these like unbiased glasses on, and if you know why you're doing these steps, it's so much easier. But I'm also going to talk a bit more about that soon when we talk about the interviews, like taking that step back and as you mentioned, like making sure that you also know what you're looking for and what traits depending on position, of course, that are more or less important. And also a final thing about this that you've been talking about that I think is crucial today, looking at the candidate market, of course, is the whole candidate experience. So make sure, as you say, that the candidate actually understands why they're doing this. And also, I mean, there's a lot of different assessment vendors out there, of course, today. But one thing for me, when I look at me in my role when I recruit, that is essential is, as you say, the feedback, but also not having to spend 1 or 2 hours on a long assessment. Like I remember that from my first job, it was me taking a lot of courses, and then I couldn't even look at the results, neither could the candidate, of course. So I think that part is super important for me when I set up my processes.
Like I remember early in my career, I've been in this industry for a long time, geekiest industry in the world, where it was like common that you would have candidates completing like a logic test that took like sub an hour, somewhere between 30 and an hour, and then maybe like 1, 2, 3 different personality tests that took 20-30 minutes each. I think that's like, in a candidate's market, that's going to be impossible. So accuracy, but limiting the time scope for the candidate is absolutely crucial.
Yes. And to move on to the second method, and as I just mentioned, like taking a step back, looking at a profile, I think that's extra important when you talk about your interviews also. So the second method we're going to talk about is structured interviews. So to try to summarize it, what it is, it's basically a standardized way of comparing candidates. So it's a lot related to what Linnea talked about with structure again. So when you have a structured interview in place, it's simple. If you look at it, like what you're supposed to do is to ask the same type of question to each and every candidate in the exact same order. It may not sound that hard, but the most important part is, of course, to take this step back and actually look at what is the actual role, what are the competencies that we're looking for. And since these questions are predetermined, when you have your structured interview in place for the processes you're going to do, you minimize the risk of being subjective when you assess a candidate. And I know, again, looking back at when I started working with recruitment, we didn't have like the whole awareness of this. Pretty much didn't exist like 10 years ago. But for me, it was very much an eye-opener, starting systematically to first of all like look at the position, what are the like must-haves and not, and set up a structured interview where I actually had a battery of questions, because like if you don't have that, of course you're human, you will base your questions on your gut feeling. And if we take the opposite to a structured interview, is of course a unstructured interview. And it's much easier to fall in that trap. For example, if I would interview you, Linnea, I'm pretty sure that I would look at your resume and I would see, as you said in the beginning, oh, we went to the same school, oh, we studied the same thing. And then I will not make an unbiased hiring decision. I will not be able to compare you to other candidates. So as you've been saying all the time, it will be an unfair way of assessing your skills and
exactly. And if I can jump in here, because I had like quite an interesting, I mean, I obviously big fan of structured interviews. I had a question with, or a discussion with a hiring manager a while back, where the hiring manager was like, we were trying to like convince, like, okay, you need to use the structure. This is how you do it. This is the method. But he was like, oh, it's going to be super stiff and I'm going to come across as a robot. Where that's like not at all my experience, but it was super interesting to hear, like, how do you like structure these interviews so that they are fair, gather the right data, but also like come across as a natural way of interviewing.
Yeah, of course, that's super important. Again, like relating to what we talked about with candidate experience, I think that is one thing to keep in mind when you have your structured interview in place, to actually, again, communication, like communicate with the candidate. It's not like you need to hide that you have a battery of questions that you're going to ask. Is, I would say, rather the opposite. It sends out a much more professional picture of you as an employer if you let the candidate know to start with that this is the position we're hiring for, and I'm going to ask you a couple of like situation-based questions to get to know you better as a person. So great question. I think it's important to start there instead of just jumping in, and it's much easier for you to not feel what you said, Linnea, like, oh, the candidate will like feel that I'm a robot, another human being hosting this interview. So that's one thing. And the second thing, when you create your structured interview, I've been mentioned it already, but take that step back, do the prep work, and ask yourself what type of competencies are you looking for. And I know, again, with my own experience, that this can of course be a challenge when you sit down with a hiring manager, this classical like must-haves, nice-to-haves, but really make sure that you spend time on this, because usually where you fail in the process is if you don't have the foundation set, if you don't know what you're looking for. So super important. And when you create your questions, there's, I guess you have a lot of different methods for that also, Linnea, that you can share. But one thing I would say that you can start with is like pretty simple. Try not to use like yes or no questions. Like, are you structured at what you do at work? Like, yes, I am. It doesn't tell you that much about the candidate's actual competencies. So to summarize it, like create a set of questions that gives you examples of how competence you're looking for is exemplified. And one technique that I use a lot just to have like back of my head when I create these questions is a technique called the STAR technique. I guess it's pretty common today. So it stands for situation, task, action, result. So it's a good like way of structuring your questions, again, to get down to the actual situation, like how did the candidate actually behave? What was the result? So what you do is, for example, again, to take that question that I had as an example, like, are you structured at what you do? Like, ask the candidate first about, could you tell me about a situation? Like, what did you do in this project? And the actual result. So I think that technique, for me at least, has been very, very helpful when like creating these batteries for my structured interviews.
I mean, I really agree, and we work in the same way. And I think I'm thinking about a lot of things, but one thing is like when you create these questions, because as you say, it can be challenging. So base it on the need to haves, but also it can be easier to create these questions if you think about like more extreme situations. It can be as easy, like, I mean, take your example now, like a structure, like, can you describe a situation where like, you needed to use a lot of structure? It can be like just adding the word, like, can you describe a challenging situation where you had to use a lot of structure? The most recent situation that really involved a lot of different details, so that you really try to find a situation that triggers a lot of those behaviors. That can be a good way to to frame the questions to get better examples. And then like the final thing I want to add to interviews is like same question, same order, definitely STAR method of interviewing is the best way to go about it. But then also make sure that you rate the question so that it's not just you have this great question and it's super structured, but then at the end of the day, you're just going to be like, good answer, it felt great. But rather like having a scale, we use 1 to 5 with like predefined anchors. What does great look like so that you have decided that beforehand?
Really good point. And actually I do the same, of course, in Jobbalon, when I have interviews, it's great to be able to actually grade the candidates because of the reasons you've already been mentioning, but also the step after that, like when you sit down with the hiring manager and the next person following up after your interview, how are they supposed to know, like, why was that a good answer or not? So as you say, to have a grading is of course like also super crucial to make it valid. Yeah. For sure. And to move on to our final method here, work sample tests. And this is something I'm looking at this for our recruitments at Jobbalon today, like how we can tweak our work sample tests. So Linnea, to start off, like what is the work sample test?
A work sample test is a kind of like mini example of showing the behaviors that you need to do at work. So it's a way to a sample where you do the actual work. I think a good example can be if you're going to hire a bus driver. It's easy to think like, oh, let's just let them drive the bus around at the parking lot. That will show if they're a good bus driver. A good work sample test will be having the candidates drive the bus in rush hour with like all the people on the bus, the grumpy old man and the screaming kid, because that will be a lot more closer to the real job. So creating something, but then that's going to be really challenging to actually have candidates driving the bus in rush hour. So you need to mimic something, but in a format that actually you can handle. And I think like a lot of the stuff that we said on structured interviews will hold true for work sample tests. Like base them on the job description. How can you get as close as possible to the actual work without letting candidate do work for free? I've seen those examples. That's just bad manners. But try to do that in a condensed way so that you don't demand too much effort from the candidate, but still have data that will help you make a decision. But then it's also about like setting up the criteria beforehand, just like with the interview. You got to know what you're looking for. Same thing with the work sample test. We always like set up criteria. We always send those criteria to the candidate so that the candidates all know this is what we will be evaluating. And then same thing as with interviews, evaluate on in a data-driven way during the case or during the work sample test so that you don't affect each other. So before like discussing with other assessors, how did you think it went? Make sure that you have kind of locked your own rating so that you don't impact each other. Because otherwise it's, if I have a work sample test when me and my boss are the assessors, if he says something, very likely I'm going to agree. Because
let me see, I lost Linnea now.
Sorry.
Oh, no, you're back.
Okay, sorry. My internet is unstable. So, but shortly speaking, like close to the job, as simple, without demanding too much of the candidate, predefined criteria, and try to like lock your assessment. And also, if you can, include some feedback so that there's something that, the candidate gets out of the process.
Yeah. And one thing that I've been thinking about as well is the question, like, when do you send these out? So looking at Alva, for example, like how do you use these tests and when do you send them out?
We have two different versions, a little bit depending on the role, but roughly speaking, almost at the very, very end of the selection process, simply because we don't want to demand too much time spent from too many candidates. We want it to be we never send a candidate to a case if we don't already kind of know that we could potentially hire this person, so that we don't waste their time. And that we also know that they're committed and want to do it. So at the end of the process, then we've had examples of when we've done like mini cases that we used actually like really early. For instance, when we hired a content writer, we had them very early write like a super simple task so that we could assess like writing ability very early. And then I think in some cases, for instance, when it comes to our engineers, we do it sort of like mid process. So the engineering process for us looks like it's tests, it's a first interview with HR, then it's a coding test, and the review is done in a technical interview, and then there might be a final interview. So then it's more mid, but that's
yeah, we have, I think, similar to that one in our engineer processes. But what I think is hard also to know is sometimes like when should you use a live work sample test and take home test? Just a short comment about that, because I think that's also super interesting. Like, do you have any like research or like what's the validity if you look at like if you compare a live case test and something that the candidate can actually take home, and hopefully they do not ask other for help, but of course that can happen. So do you have any thoughts about that?
I think the important thing is like you got to know what you're assessing. So as doing a live case, if that assesses abilities that are needed on the job, great. If it's important on the job to like think on your feet, present in front of people, all those qualities that you use when you do it live, then that's great. If that's not important, then maybe it's better with like something that you do at home. So I would say it depends on what you're going to do in the role. And then one final comment is like semi-related, as long as you do the same for all candidates.
Just not say that. That's the key, the most important part.
Exactly. And because I mean, sometimes I think now in the like hybrid, we've had examples where like some candidates like, but I can just swing by and present the case. And some are like remote. Never mix and match those. It's fine to do on-site, it's fine to do remote, just do the same for all candidates.
Just had that discussion actually yesterday with one of the hiring managers, and when it was a mix, and as you say, as long as you do the same type of work assessment, then you can compare candidates and again grade them also. So now I'm seeing we're running out of time. Feels like we've been talking for 10 minutes, but it's already 35. So before we end this, I thought just 3 final like key takeaways, Linnea, if you want to give something for everyone that's been listening in, something that they can just bring with them after today.
I think like, I mean, one thing is obviously we've said it so many times, structure, have a plan, stick to that plan. We always spell out our hiring process in the job ad so that we can't detour and replan something. But it was like, we've already committed. So structure is key. Like more objective methods is super helpful. So a good rule of thumb is the less human intervention or like human assessments, the better. That doesn't mean that we have to like completely take the human aspect out of it, but the actual assessments need to be like objective, data driven, and so forth. And then I think like we are getting better and better at this when it comes to like the recruitment and like HR space. I think a lot of people are very, very competent here, but the majority of the work still sits with the hiring manager. So I think it's super important to like educate and show a clear purpose. Like, why do they have to commit to this type of process? What's in it for them? Well, I mean, and the short and sweet reasoning is like a fairer process that will create higher accuracy so they can hire a better team, but like educate them.
I think that final thing is super important, because it doesn't matter how trained you are within HR. I've seen that a lot. The whole HR team, they're convinced, they know that, okay, this is methods that we should use, but you need more than that. You need the whole organizations to be with you. And as you say, I think you need training. The comment you just made there, of course, yeah, that sounds good, but to really get the hiring manager to understand the purpose and the results that you're going to gain of it. A final comment, and before we wrap everything up, maybe actually it was something I just popped up when we just started this. Maybe that could be a second webinar, Linnea. I don't know if you've been talking a lot about that, but talking about unbiased recruitment methods. I had a colleague reaching out to me saying that, oh, we should use AI for unbiased recruitment interviews, and something that I would love to dig deeper down into and understand like how you could use these and are they valid, etc. So just as a little heads up, perhaps that's something we can discuss in another webinar.
Cliffhanger. I have opinions. Exactly. I have opinions. I have studies. Yes.
Yeah. So I that was what I thought. Like when she reached out, I was like, I need to discuss this with Linnea. I think she will have opinions about it because, of course, there's a lot of AI tools out there that also our customers is asking us about a lot. So as you said, good cliffhanger. We will happily answer any of your questions. So now the time is a bit tight, so we will actually end this webinar for today. And thanks to everyone tuning in, and just reach out to me, Linnea, if you have questions, and we will of course answer those. And thank you, Linnea. I hope to see you soon again for another webinar.
Yes. Take care. Thank you for joining, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.